Değerli konuklarımızın yerlerini almasını rica ediyorum. Panelimizi hızlı bir şekilde gecikmeden başlatmak istiyoruz. Lütfen hemen yerlerimizi alırsak. Birinci panelle başlayacağız programımızı. Ardından diğer oturumlar ve etkinliklerle devam edeceğiz. Evet, eğer hazırsak ben Özgür Bey'i davet ederek Türkiye Sigorta Birliği Genel Sekreteri Sayın Özgür Obalı'yı davet etmek istiyorum önce. Burada değerli konuklar, Sigorta Pazarları ve Emeklilik Yatırım Fonlarının pandemi sonrasında değerlendirilmesi ve yeni fırsatları konuşacağız, değerlendireceğiz. Özgür Bey hoş geldiniz.
Hoş bulduk.
Birazdan Özgür Bey konuklarını tanıtacak ama ben öncelikle davet edeyim. Onların kimler olduğunu, hangi görevde olduğunu da Özgür Bey'in anlatmasını rica edelim kısaca. Evet, bu bölümde Sayın Özgür Obalı'nın panelistliğinde Sayın Margarita Antonaki, Sayın Robert Neal, Sayın Mehmet Üvez burada fiziki olarak toplantıya katılacaklar. Alkışlayarak alalım ve online olarak etkinliğimize bu panele katılacak olan Robert Garden ve de Michaela Kohler da yine hazır durumdalar. Değerli konuklarımıza tekrar hoş geldiniz diyelim. Özgür Bey söz sizde. Teşekkür ederiz. Buyurun.
Teşekkürler Hakan Bey. Efendim hepinize günaydın. Bu sene 11.sini gerçekleştirdiğimiz Sigorta Haftası çerçevesinde düzenlediğimiz zirvemize hepiniz hoş geldiniz, şeref verdiniz. Sabahleyin açılış konuşmalarından sonra şimdi gerçekten çok değerli konuklarla dünyada ve Türkiye'de, Amerika'dan Avrupa'ya sigorta dünyasını etkileyen bir takım temel faktörleri hep beraber gün boyunca değerlendiriyor olacağız. İşte iklim krizi dedik, sabah açılış konuşmalarında da işittiniz. İşte yeşil sigorta, dünyadaki pandeminin etkileri, paradigma değişiklikleri, gerçekten ciddi anlamda hepimizi etkileyen faktörler ve bizi yeni dünyada, yeni denklemde neler bekliyor? Bunları hep beraber bu 1,5 gün boyunca tartışıyor olacağız. Ben bu vesileyle de hepinize hoş geldiniz demek istedim. Ev sahipliği perspektifinde. Şimdi panele geçeceğim. İlk panelimiz malumunuz olduğu üzere özellikle küresel sigorta piyasaları pandemi döneminde nasıl geçirdi, pandemiden ne gibi dersler çıkardık üzerine kurulu bir tema üzerine oluşturduk. Burada çok değerli Uluslararası Sigorta Birliği'nin temsilcileri var. Bazıları online bizle bağlandı. Burada fiziki olarak da konuklarımızı ağırlıyoruz. İBR'den de Mehmet Bey aramızda. O da bize bir makroekonomik perspektif çizecek. Değerli panelistlerimiz de herhalde ekrana aldık. Robert ve Michaela. Onlara da hoş geldiniz demek istiyorum. Covid-19 pandemisi baş gösterdiğinde verilen tepkiyi, tüm ülkelerle belli başlı başat özellikler nelerdi, rakamlarla da bunları destekleyerek bir ufuk turu yapma amacındayız. Pandeminin boyutları pek çok ülkede kamu ve özel sektörün işbirliğini çok kritik hale getirdi. Yani bunun altından hepimiz tek başımıza kalkamazdık. Dolayısıyla bunlar için de çok önemli bir test run oldu bu süreç. İş durması gibi kritik branşlarda kamunun desteği kritik hale geldi. Pandemi beraberinde uygulanan karantina, uzaktan çalışma modelleri, radikal değişikliklerin hayatımıza girmesine neden oldu. Ciddi bir şok dalgası yaşadık önce, sarsıldık ama sonra toparladık ve ciddi anlamda da bu yeni döneme, bu yeni paradigma değişikliğine adapte olduk. Ama gerçekten ben hepimiz de aynı şeyi hissediyorum bilmiyorum ama ciddi anlamda da kendimize şaşırdık bazı noktalarda. Nasıl bu kadar hızlı adapte olabildik bu sürece diye. Farkındaysanız pandemi sonrasında da çok hızlı adapte olduk. Bir anda maskeler atıldı. Demek ki insanoğlu zorlandığı zaman gerçekten çok hızlı adapte olabiliyor. Dijital teknolojilerin adaptasyonu da çok hızlı oldu. Acaba derken gerçekten bunları uygular gördük kendimizi. Dolayısıyla pandeminin yanı sıra iklim değişikliklerinden de yine bahsediyor olacağız. Wildfire'lar hem işte dünyanın birçok yerinde vuku buldu. Ben daha fazla sözü uzatmadan panelistlerimize söz vermek istiyorum. Arada bir takım giriş çıkışlarım olacak sürece ama ana rolü onlar alacaklar. Ben şimdi kendilerini tanıtmak istiyorum size. Öncelikle aramızda Michaela Köhler var. Kendisi Avrupa Sigorta Birliği Genel Sekreteri. Yaklaşık gerçekten 2007 yılından beri bu görevi ifa ediyor. Kendisi aynı zamanda uluslararası, yani bizim çatı örgütümüz, dünya çatı örgütümüz CİFİA'nın da genel sekreterliğini yürütüyor. Çok deneyimli bir sigorta profesyoneli. Kendisi Alman vatandaşı ve Osburg Üniversitesi Hukuk bölümünden mezun. Yine Mehmet Bey EBRD'den, kendisi Türkiye Başkan Vekili, 2015'ten beri EBRD'de görev yapıyor. 1 Ocak 2022'den geçerli olmak üzere Ankara Ofis Başkanı ve Vekil olarak atandı. Türk Hükümeti Uluslararası Kuruluşlar, Finans Kuruluşları ile çalışma konusunda 20 yılı aşkın bir deneyime sahip kendisi. University of Rochester, William Simmons School of Business ve MBA derecesine sahip. Ankara Üniversitesi Siyasal Bilgiler Fakültesi mezunu. Robert Gordon, kendisi yine online bize bağlandı. Çok teşekkürler. Kendisi kıdemli başkan yardımcısı, Amerikan Mal ve Kaza Sigortaları Politik Araştırma Uluslararası İlişkilerden sorumlu. O da çok yıllardır sigorta sektörüne önemli hizmetler veren Amerikan Mal ve Kaza Sigortası Birliği'nin Politik Araştırma ve Uluslararası İlişkiler Biriminin kıdemli başkan yardımcısı görevini sürdürüyor. Aynı zamanda şu anda kapsamlı eyalet federal savunuculuk aletleri, medya erişimi, bilgi ürünleri için politika desteği koordine ediyor. Robert Neal aramızda, yine kendisi da Amerika'dan kalk geldi. Yine Amerikan Hayat Sigortacıları Konseyi üyesi, uluslararası kamu ilişkilerinden sorumlu başkan yardımcısı. Robert'ta özellikle emeklilik, sigorta, life, OECD, IOPS iş akışları verilerinin yani zorla yerleştirilmesi diye Türkçe'ye çevrilmiş ama mandatory anlamına geliyor İngilizce'de. Veri gizlileri, reasüransın zorunluluğu gibi konularda aktif şekilde kendi alanında görev yapıyor. Finans alanında Auburn Üniversitesi'nden diploması var. Stanford Üniversitesi'nden de Cumberland Hukuk Fakültesi'nden doktor unvanını yaptı. Çok deneyimli bir sigorta profesyoneli. Ta 1995'ten bu tarafa. Kendisinden çok öğreneceğim şey var kendi adıma, onu da söyleyeyim. Çok önemli benzer pratiklerimiz var Yunanistan'la. Bizimle aynı sorunları benzer şekilde aynı dönemde yaşadılar. Kendisi de burada deneyimlerini paylaşmak üzere bizlerle beraber. Kendisi aynı zamanda Nisan ayından beri Genel Sekreter Danışmanlığı görevini yürütüyor. Özel Sigorta Meslek Fonu Yönetim Kurulu Başkan Yardımcılığı ve Yunanistan Sigorta Eğitim Enstitüsü'nün de öğretim görevlisi. Ben tekrar hepinizin adına onlara hoş geldiniz diyorum. Güzel bir panel olmasını. Michaela, öncelikle senden başlamak isterim. For my Turkish, please apologize me. I will just give a heart and warm thanks to all my panelists, and I'll continue in English, Turkish, sorry. Michaela, sizinle başlamak gerekirse, Avrupa Birliği'ne bağlı ülkelerin sigorta piyasaları nasıl geçirdi pandemi dönemini, ne gibi dersler aldı, her kriz gibi bu krizin de sunduğu beklenmedik fırsatlar oldu. Bize bunlardan biraz bahsedebilir misin? Beklettiğimiz için de özür dilerim, sarkmadan dolayı. Michaela, duyabiliyor musun bizi? Michaela?
Yes, are you speaking to me?
Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't have translation.
Sorry. So I'll translate you. I mean, sorry for the. I think I was thinking that the translation is coming to you. So yeah. Just I mean, from your perspective, from the European Union perspective, this pandemic effect, how will it affect the markets? From the insurance Europe's perspective, can you please give us some clues about what we have learned from these lessons, Michaela, and this crisis, what changed for our life dramatically, and what will be the changing things for our future? Can you give us a little bit? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm very happy to give you the view from the European insurance sector, Özgür, and thank you very much for inviting me. I have also a small presentation that, as you can see, is only illustrating a little bit my points moving forward. So we are, as you are very well aware, we are living now for the last 2 years with the pandemic. And while we have seen a gradual return to a new normal, I think it is important that we remind ourselves that COVID-19 has not disappeared. So obviously we need to remain vigilant how the situation evolves, especially also after the summer. Now, allow me then to make a short assessment of the impact of the pandemic on the European insurance sector and which lessons we have learned. If you move to the next slide, let me start with the impact. And of course, I think it is very important that we always remind ourselves that COVID-19 was really a tragedy for many people. It has cost many lives and it has created immense economic hardship for many people and businesses around the world. And it has also been an extremely challenging period for both insurers and their customers. But I believe that faced with these challenges, the insurance industry in Europe has remained strong and insurers have generally maintained their solvency position. We have seen that in some countries, solvency ratios were hit hard during the first quarter of 2020, but these countries reported full recovery already in the second quarter of this year. Moreover, European insurers have, throughout the pandemic, successfully ensured business continuity, and they remained committed to honoring their promises to customers. They also launched a broad range of voluntary goodwill initiatives to provide relief. And I think this is very important to notice. I think my slideshow has advanced a little bit too much. If you go back, please. One more. And one more. No, you went forward. I think just go to slide 2. Yeah, perfect. So the insurance sector has also launched a broad range of voluntary goodwill initiatives to provide relief to policyholders. Now, there have been various attempts to quantify the impact of the pandemic on the insurance sector. And clearly that is not an easy exercise. Depending on the sources, when you look at COVID-19 insurance losses globally, they have been estimated at anywhere between $50 billion or $100 billion, or 41 to 82 billion euros, respectively. Now, we have some insurance CEOs that have described the pandemic as the largest ever insurance event. And the impact of the pandemic on the insurance sector has been very different depending on the country. And there are, of course, various reasons. First, insurers' role in the different countries varies sometimes significantly. But then, and that was even more important, measures taken by the governments in response to the pandemic have been very different from country to country, with some countries going in complete lockdown, others remaining relatively open throughout the pandemic. But let me now turn to the 4 key lessons we learned in Europe, and we can go to the next slide, which I think you, yeah. Thank you very much. So what we see in the 4 lessons, lessons 1, digital, there is really a need for a digital-friendly regulatory and legislative environment. As I said by way of introduction, the insurance sector has remained fully operational, and this ability to keep operationally fully on top was dependent largely on the ability of the sector to swiftly their operations online. And that, of course, was made possible by insurers' continued investment in technology and digitalization. We have done that in the past to facilitate already distribution, claims management, and advice, amongst other things. And what we noted in the pandemic, that there were some delays in the beginning, but these were generally minor, and they were mostly seen in those markets that still have strict requirements in terms of provision of paper documentation, or in markets where customers prefer to pay their premiums in cash. Overall, we believe, however, that the pandemic has taught us one very important lesson, and that is that the importance, that it is very important to have a legislative and regulatory environment, both at European but also at national level, that is digital friendly and fit for the future. And in particular, if we consider the fact that digitalization of our society is only going to increase. Now, moving to the second lesson, and this is more emphasis on cover over cost. We have in EU regulation and also in some national legislation very strongly focus on costs. So all the information is targeting cost elements. But we believe cover will become much more important. Policyholders are likely to pay increasing attention to what is being covered. And the pandemic confirmed that the provision of information to policyholders on how insurance works, what products cover and not cover, and what the terms and conditions of policy entails is key. So what we need to address is any potential understanding gap on coverage between policyholders and insurers and distributors. And we believe this requires an ongoing dialogue between industry, customers, supervisors, and regulators. And at European level, we have a number of regulatory initiatives that are coming up to reform the distribution, advice, and generally interaction with consumers. And it will be important that this lesson will be taken into account. Let me now turn to the third lesson. And the third lesson, I think we have taken on the prudential side. And what we have learned is that improvements to Solvency II are necessary. COVID-19 was certainly the first real test of the EU Solvency II framework, and it has confirmed our assessment that Solvency II has clearly contributed to increasing the resilience of the European insurance sector. At the same time, we have also noted that COVID-19 induced market volatility in the first year that we observed in the first months of the pandemic, confirmed our concerns about the fact that Solvency II can exaggerate the impact of short-term price movements in the financial markets on insurers' balance sheet and on their solvency position. So we want to use the current Solvency II review as a key opportunity to improve the design and the calibration of the Solvency II framework. And the challenge will be to make the necessary improvements that will address the current flaws like volatility and to better reflect the real risk and economies of insurers' long-term business. And the last lesson I think learned is that there are systemic risks, such as pandemic risks, where insurability is really coming to its limits. Because when we entered, obviously, COVID-19, we had a lot of questions and discussions, both at national and European level, whether pandemic risk can be covered by insurers. And in short, our message has been that pandemic risk typically cannot be covered, especially in certain business lines, such as business interruptions. And there are good reasons for this. A very strong political nature of the consequences of the pandemic has meant that the pandemic came with widespread lockdowns imposed by governments. And obviously, it is not insurable, as insurers cannot insure against decisions made by governments. We also have seen the global and systemic nature of the pandemic. Pandemics are a systemic risk that cannot generally be covered through the existing insurance model, in which the claims of the few are shared by many. Standard insurance policies typically provide protection only against risks that cannot all happen at the same time, as these can be offered at prices that customers can afford. So it is also very clear, and that is the fourth lesson, that we will have to rely on a very strong involvement of public authorities if we were to cover pandemic risk. Now, the last part, Özgür, you have asked me also to look forward. Maybe you can move also to the next slide now. Yes, perfect. Thank you. Now, I thought I'd give you an assessment how the EU regulatory agenda will likely impact the development of the insurance market moving forward. As you are all aware, since December 2019, we have the von der Leyen Commission, and they started with a huge ambition with the Green Deal and digital transformation. And then, of course, the pandemic happened first. And now, in addition, we also see ourselves confronted with the war and all these unprecedented events in Ukraine, which are not only costing many lives, but are also raising other risks like cyber exposure. So when we look at the regulatory environment, we have EU institutions in crisis mode, but EU institutions that are still not giving up on their regulatory agenda, but they dedicate less time and energy for engagement with organizations such as ours. So for us, it means, this engagement needs to be only beefed up. And it is also clear for all of us, and that is the big lesson, I think, from the pandemic, that we need to adapt to an increasingly changing world. And adaptation and collaboration, I think, are the key words for that, because it is clear that adapting means also working together more, joining forces, not only across the industry, but also between the private and public sectors, because many of the challenges that we are facing and that we will be facing are of such nature that the response will have to be multifaceted and found at a larger scale. Let me give you a couple of examples. NatCat is clearly an example where insurers are already cooperating with public authorities, but with climate change becoming a growing challenge, there will be even more need for collaboration. And with more innovative solutions, especially on adaptation, insurers can help societies adapt to climate change through providing cover and relief and working in public-private partnership with authorities on urban planning and zoning. Mitigation of climate risk is equally important by limiting greenhouse gas emissions. And again, insurers can hugely contribute by gradually and in a phased-in approach, refraining from underwriting certain activities or by investing increasingly in sustainable assets as they become more and more available. The von der Leyen Commission understood that the whole economy needs to buy into the green agenda. And with the Green Deal, they were rolling out a package of regulatory initiatives, such as a taxonomy that defines what is green and what is brown. They have launched a corporate sustainability reporting directive that will impose on 55,000 or more companies in Europe to report their environmental, social, and governance data. Obviously, the financial sector is also asked to report these ESG data. We will have in Europe a European single access point where all this information can be available free of charge from the source. And a Solvency II review is underway to make the insurance sector ready to invest and bring its impressive investment power behind the project. So the whole green package shows ambition, urgency, and complexity. And certainly this will be one of the key elements that will, be decisive moving forward. The second issue that I wanted to raise for future attention is cyber, where we also need collaboration. Let's first maybe look at the insurer's own cyber defense. There is more and more initiative underway, and also at European level, a directive to beef up the cyber defenses of our industry. But there is also the challenge to provide better cyber cover. And for this, we need to work with public and private sectors, first to raise awareness, but second also to ensure that the insurance sector can get data of cyber breaches that have happened, so that we as a sector will be able to really assess the risk of cyber on a databases and not just on the basis of risk modeling. So also here a clear example where public and private sector collaboration in the future will be key. And let me close maybe with the last outlook on digitalization, because I believe really this will also have a key impact. When you look at all the new technologies, artificial intelligence, blockchain, cloud computing, all these technologies carry an enormous transformational potential for industries, consumers, and the society as a whole. And again, the Commission has ambition for the EU to become a global role model for the digital economy and to ensure that everybody can benefit from the digital transformation. Again, this has translated into a huge number of legislative proposals. There are good intentions, but there is also a real risk of over-regulation, as we see, unfortunately, in many areas. When you look at the challenges for the insurance sector. In artificial intelligence, there is a risk that we might be defined as a high-risk category, which would clearly curb our possibility to use artificial intelligence. We will see an initiative by the Commission on open insurance early next year. And there is a risk that big techs gain access to insurance data via a framework without data reciprocity. And what we also see in all this debate, that there is an increased risk of restricting insurers' access to certain types of data and thus diminishing insurability. The buzzword here is the so-called right to be forgotten, for example, when it comes to critical illnesses such as cancer. And this certainly will also keep us busy. Now, all these regulatory initiatives means that non-European Union countries with less stringent rules or no rules at all might have a head start. But let's also not forget there are also opportunities by really operating in a very clear framework. There are also chances that, for example, insurers can benefit. We will, in all likelihood, see an initiative also early next year where the Commission will put forward regulation that will give insurers access to car data, something that we have been really working hard for in the last 7 to 8 years, because we have seen that the car manufacturers are sitting, on the car data and have effectively blocked the insurers' access. So overall, I believe as Insurance Europe, we really do our best to represent your interest, both vis-à-vis the EU, but also global regulators. And I would like to thank Özgür and the entire team for their ongoing support, and also you as their members for your support of our work. Özgür, thank you very much again for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Michaela, for your comprehensive speech. You give us really many brief facts and clues about what we are expecting for the future and what we are needing for the new era. Thank you very much. If you have questions from the floor, we may thank you. So let's take the words from Michaela to Robert. Robert'tan şimdi.
Great. Let me.
Robert, can you hear me?
Screen here.
Robert'a ekrana verir miyiz? Okay. Robert Avrupa'dan.
Can you see that all right?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, let's take the tour from Europe to US, from the non-life, all the non-life branches. What are the new, for the new era? Please, the floor is yours, and thank you very much to join us in this late hour. We have really a huge time gap. I think it's night, 3 o'clock in the evening. So thank you very much for your patience. Floor is yours.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to join you today on behalf of APCIA, the Primary Property Casualty Insurance Trade Association in the U.S. The United States survived the pandemic, but I'm going to overview some of the top challenges stemming from the pandemic, including some of the ones Michaela talked about. I'll also talk about some of the economic challenges as a result of the pandemic, as well as cyber risks, hiring competition, ESG, and then some ongoing COVID issues. A deteriorating economy following the pandemic is really our top challenge right now. The Federal Reserve Board forecasts that the United States gross domestic product would slow to 2% this year, and to cool record inflation rate hikes, increasing interest rates by at least 2%. And experts now predict a 50% chance of a recession or stagflation, maybe more if another COVID wave hits. This chart, you can see inflation has hit a 40-year record, actually not only in the United States, but a similar record in the EU, well above 8%. The producer price index, which is the increase in wholesale prices, that spiked over 11% and will be transitory, but the supply chain are now making inflation last much longer than expected, and insurers are now pricing in long-lasting inflation. And we've been having to explain to regulators and policyholders that as bad as inflation is, inflation for insurance costs has been increasing even faster than the underlying consumer price index, and much faster than either insurance premium increases or investment yields. So this slide lists the cost indicators for auto and homeowner insurance. The black bars are the underlying rate of inflation, but you can see that the key insurance costs, such as vehicle prices and construction rebuilding costs, the red bars, are spiking much more dramatically, much higher than the underlying inflation, and that's really increasing insurance loss costs. Now, some of the inflation dangers are particularly pernicious for U.S. insurers because there's a time lag in forecasting, and in the United States, insurers have to obtain state approval, government approval for their rate increases. And there's a lot of political resistance to that as the rate increases from inflation get higher. Of course, the inflation can also increase insurers' long-tail exposures, and particularly something like COVID. We don't know what the long-term effects are going to be. One of the impacts from COVID was that driving reduced temporarily in 2020, but in 2021, the miles driven has largely returned to normal. And while the overall loss ratios for auto insurance for the entire year were not that much higher than the longer term average, if you look at the quarterly trends, it's clear that auto insurance losses have rapidly escalated as we have entered into 2022, and the accident frequency and severity has trended far worse than the long-term average by the end of the year. So one thing we've learned from the pandemic is, for whatever reason, driving has gotten worse. Fewer people are wearing seatbelts, more people are engaging in distracted driving, drug driving, drunk driving. So the situation with auto is bad, more deaths than ever on the roads right now. The red line in this graph is homeowners insurance loss ratios, and you can see those have also spiked over the last 2 years, partly from climate change, also from increasing urbanization and inflationary exposure growth. APCIA recently completed a survey finding that most homeowners are now significantly they failed to update their policies to account for the increased building inflation and climate exposures. And so that's another crisis, in part as a result of the pandemic. General liability insurance is now suffering from both inflation and social inflation, the increase in liability costs. General liability insurance has increased 57.5% over the last 4 years, and you can see on the right. These graphs show insurers' return on revenue. So the black line on the left side is the return on revenue. You can see insurance profitability has been declining long term. The bars, the upper bars are the investment return, whereas the lower bars are underwriting, and you can see insurers are making almost no money on their underwriting. It starts since the Great Depression, and the bond indexes are significantly down as well. Now, a lot of the consumer activists have attacked insurers' growing surplus, but that fails to recognize that insurers' surplus to premium ratio has been very constant. So the surplus increase is just following the increase in exposures and risks, keeping the overall leveraging constant. Social inflation or lawsuit abuse, spiraling litigation costs, those have been growing very significantly long term. Litigation costs are now consuming 2.3% of the United States gross domestic product. That's roughly $4,000 per family. That's primarily the problem as a result of the unreasonably high jackpot jury awards, and that's now being exacerbated by lawyer advertising that has increased greatly, and it's also being encouraged by third-party litigation financing, outside funding of lawsuits. The number of jury awards exceeding $20 million has quadrupled from the average 20 years ago. And you can see on these graphs, lawsuits are producing much higher awards. The left side is awards for deaths, rapid increase. The right graph shows a similar increase in awards for sexual discrimination and harassment. This is why reining in litigation abuse is a top priority for APCIA to reduce consumer insurance costs. And this is, again, there was a temporary reprieve during the pandemic, but now it's rapidly getting worse again. Cyber insurance, Michaela indicated, is a top risk, particularly as more industries went remote during the pandemic. Over the last year, cyber losses and rates both spiked. The policy limits and reinsurance capacity in the marketplace tightened, and cybersecurity underwriting standards have been greatly tightened as well. And on these graphs, you can see the escalation in both the cyber losses and the rate increases over the last few years, a dramatic rise. And these two graphs track commercial insurance rate increases for property casualty insurance in the United States. And while most lines have generally had significant increases over the last 2 years, you can see that cyber insurance, which is the top right line, has really outstripped all of the other commercial lines. The United States, as well as a number of the international financial regulators, are particularly concerned about the increasing attacks on managed service providers and the cloud. And there are a lot of questions now about whether cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, such as the cloud, could create economic systemic risk. It's interesting, the left graph here shows that cyber attacks impacting individual, personally identifiable information has decreased. There are fewer consumer victims now of cyber attacks, but the right graph shows that successful attacks on companies for things like ransomware and espionage has greatly increased. So that's where the risk is really escalating. Interestingly enough, talent competition has become a big, big issue. So in the United States, a recent CEO survey found the shortage of skilled labor was the biggest business disruptor coming out of the pandemic. This left graph is the ratio of unemployed persons compared to job openings. Early in the pandemic, there were nearly 5 unemployed workers for every job opening. Now, there are fewer available job seekers than job openings. So there's a huge need for more labor supply. The right top graph similarly shows the growing gap between job openings that have spiked and job hires, which have barely increased. So the pandemic pushed many workers permanently out of the workforce, and that's creating a major supply-demand imbalance. ESG is another top insurance and commercial insurance issue. And the United States has had past ESG waves in the 1960s, and it really hit insurance in the 1990s. Similar to what Michaela said, ESG concerns started spiking before the pandemic. And in the US, they really focused first on sexual harassment, but now they've increased, and they're particularly focused on racial equity and climate change. The ESG expectations for businesses have evolved. Starbucks board chair explained that corporate America is now being held accountable for civil justice. And ESG activism, we've seen shift from interest of a small number of activist investors to now it's a top United States, all of government priority. And a fundamental challenge for businesses and insurers in our highly polarized society is how to respond to all of these demands to be more forward-leaning on ESG, but without distracting from companies' core mission or creating new liability exposures or alienating other stakeholders. So we have a lot of CEOs who say, gosh, I really wish I could focus on our business instead of all of these other outside risks. But we now know that insurers in the United States are going to face multiple layers of state and federal regulation. They're further along on the environment. They're still working out the approach on the social issues. Some of the federal ESG regulation is going to include the Securities and Exchange Commission has new proposed climate disclosure rules. Securities boards are requiring gender and LGBTQ diversity, and our Equal Employment Opportunity is requiring, Commission is requiring diversity reporting. And then, of course, there are numerous international standards that are being discussed in different forums for environmental reporting. This graph shows that shareholder ESG demands in the United States have really spiked, particularly demanding climate disclosures or divestment by insurers. The Securities and Exchange Commission under the current administration is no longer allowing companies to reject most shareholder proxy activism, and that's resulted in a massive increase in ESG shareholder votes, and a significant percentage now are receiving majority approval, including one requiring disclosure by one of the largest insurance companies in the United States just this last week. Some of the specific additional environmental challenges you can see here: insured catastrophe losses globally have very much increased, especially over the recent years, where you've had a number of record or near record catastrophic losses, and the inflation adjusted averages are going up. APCIA members believe insurers are natural leaders for improving environmental resiliency and mitigation. So our members have helped secure funding, government funding, for dozens of environmental programs that reduce climate losses and improve resiliency. We also educate policymakers that accurate insurance pricing sends very beneficial risk signals to the marketplace, for example, by charging higher rates for buildings in environmentally vulnerable areas. Weather modelers that we've worked with suggest climate change will increase global property insurance premium by somewhere between 33 to 41% over the next 2 decades. That doesn't create an end the world systemic risk, but cumulatively over time, it's going to create increasing affordability challenge for consumers and lenders. And environmental activists have brought increasing pressure against financial providers for fossil fuels, but they haven't solved how do we ensure a stable transition to that future. You can't just abandon 60 to 80% of the energy marketplace. 84% of US insurers are now considering the ESG impact on their investment portfolios. 1 in 10 have divested carbon intensive assets, so a number of individual insurers are being very forward leaning. And depending on the definitions used, US property casualty insurers only have about 1.5 to at most 5% of their assets in fossil fuel stocks and bonds. So it's a very low percentage. Insurers are particularly worried in the United States about environmental liability. There have been hundreds of new climate-related lawsuits filed in just the last 5 years. A lot of those are backed by outside financiers alleging misrepresentation of image, of public nuisance, failure to warn of harm, or financial misrepresentation. If those legal attacks gain traction, it could trigger hundreds of billions of dollars in insurance-related lawsuits. So this is a very important issue for our industry. Social issues are really a mixture of global and local. So between 2011 and 2018, the number of protests and riots around the world roughly doubled, while the number of strikes quadrupled. And on the right side, it's very hard to see, but the poorest income strata have actually improved their wealth significantly in percentage terms, but the base was so low to start with that the absolute gap has increased. And the pandemic was particularly harmful to low-wage retail workers and worsened that wealth inequality. The Financial Times recently reported that Black employees held a lower share of top US financial services jobs in 2018 than they did more than a decade earlier. So this has become one of the top commitments to try and improve. And APCIA has cataloged our members' numerous new programs and commitments by our insurance company members to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we have been presenting these to our regulators and to Congress. Social issues are very much a part of our state insurance regulation. Every state prohibits unfair discrimination, which means charging different rates to the same objective risk. No insurance company in the United States uses racial data, but auto and homeowners insurance rates can sometimes be higher in urban areas, and minorities predominantly live in those urban areas. But APCIA has analyzed extensively the loss ratios in minority neighborhoods and found no evidence of unfair discrimination, no evidence of rates that are higher than losses compared to other neighborhoods. Governance is an increasing focus as well, so we encourage our members to review their ESG exposure, to prepare for more ESG reporting and enforcement and litigation. And new governance standards also involve more board accountability and integration of climate risks into insurers' oversight. Circling back to direct pandemic issues, and I'm going to align myself with Michaela's comments here. A number of groups rushed forward after the start of the pandemic with proposed public-private partnerships trying to force the insurance industry to provide pandemic insurance. But these proposals were all fundamentally flawed and none were adopted, largely because they failed to first understand the underlying problem. Experts misunderstood COVID-19 initially. They thought it could cause surface contamination, but we now know COVID is transmitted entirely through human breath. Pandemic losses initially were thought to result from government shutdowns, but we actually measured shutdowns in consumer demand for in-person services. And that's really essential to understand because business interruption insurance, business continuity insurance, it's a property policy to tide over businesses while they're fixing damaged property. And COVID-19 caused primarily economic demand shifts, not property damage. And economic demand shifts have never been insurable. Our insurance regulators told Congress early on that insurance is not suited for global pandemics because the claims are too widespread. I've published 3 papers explaining how pandemics do not meet any of the traditional criteria of insurability. And a government-public partnership simply cannot make tens of trillions of dollars of unpredictable economic demand shifts losses fit within a private insurance industry that's only a tiny fraction of that size. Pandemics really require a government solution, and that solution really needs to be tailored and directed to those in-person service industries where it can provide the greatest economic stabilization and preserve the greatest number of jobs for the most vulnerable populations. Public solutions really need to be focused on employment stability in those vulnerable sectors, not spending trillions of dollars subsidizing companies that actually continue to be profitable throughout the pandemic. So insurance is really not the right fit to address these pandemic risks. So that's an overview of where we are in the U.S. insurance marketplace, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Robert. It's really interesting that the more or less the problems are the same for all of us.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So, bir sonraki konuşmacımız Mehmet Bey. Sigorta arasına biraz bir ekonomik makro perspektif alalım dedik. EBRD Başkan Yardımcısı Mehmet Bey aramızda. Mehmet Bey, siz de pandeminin yarattığı sosyoekonomik etki analizinden biraz bahsedebilir misiniz? Pandemi toplumda makroekonomik dengelerde nasıl bir kayma yarattı? Pandemiye banka nasıl bir tepki verdi? EBRD perspektifinden ve dünya perspektifinden. Özel sektöre nasıl dokundu bu dönemde? Ne tür önlemler aldı? Hem şirket perspektifinden hem sizlerin politikalarınız açısından değerlendirebilirseniz çok mutlu oluruz. Buyurun, söz sizin.
Çok teşekkürler Özgür Bey. Gerçekten mutluluk duyuyorum. Ayrıca da sektörün bu önemli haftasını kurum adına da kutlamak istiyorum. Belki kısaca sorularınıza geçmeden evvel daha az aşina olanlarımız. Türkiye Cumhuriyeti de kurucu üyelerden biri ve yönetim kurulunda her daim temsil ediliyor. Banka bir kalkınma ve yatırım bankası. Ama bunları sadece bir yatırım amacıyla yapmıyor. Aynı zamanda rekabetçiliğin arttırılması, yeşil ekonomiye geçiş, kapsayıcılık, ekonomilerin dayanıklılığının arttırılması, iyi yönetişim gibi alanları özellikle destekliyor bütün yatırımlarında. Nisan 2022 itibariyle kuruluşumuz 1991'den bu ana kadar yaklaşık 170 milyar avro proje finansmanı sağlamış bir uluslararası finans kuruluşuyuz. Ve 6350 tane de projeyi destekledik. Çok kısa Türkiye'de neler yaptık? Halihazırda EBRD Türkiye'deki en büyük uluslararası finans kuruluşu olma niteliğine büründü geçen sene sonu itibariyle. 2009'dan günümüze toplam yatırımımız 15,5 milyar Türkiye'de ve sadece geçen sene 2 milyar avroyu aşan bir yatırımda bulunduk. Bunun da önemli bir kısmı %90'ından fazlasını özel sektöre yapıyoruz Türkiye'de. Bankacılık kesimi, finansal kuruluşlar, tarım, enerji, altyapı finansmanı alanında oldukça aktif olarak çalışıyoruz. Belki bu noktada sorunuza geçebilirim Özgür Bey. Pandemiyi biz nasıl gördük bir uluslararası kalkınma kuruluşu olarak? Tabii hiç tartışmasız, benden önceki konuşmacılar da bahsetti. Hem Mikail'a hem diğer konuşmacımız. Covid-19 pandemisi son yüzyılın gördüğü en büyük pandemi. Birçok ülkede pandemiyle savaşırken aslında sağlıkta kaynak ve kapasite sorunlarıyla karşılaştı. Bunu belki en iyi siz sektör temsilcileri gözlemlediniz. Pandemiyle mücadelede en belirleyici kriter kamunun sağlık alanına yaptığı yatırımlar, hükümetlerin pandemiye ne kadar iyi hazırlandığının aslında bir göstergesi oldu. Diğer taraftan da halk sağlığı hedefleriyle ekonomik kazanımlar arasındaki tercihler aslında pandemide erken belki müdahalelerin önüne geçti. Burada özellikle kamu, özel işbirliği, ekonomik kazanımlar ve halk sağlığı gibi etkenler bu kararların hızlı alınmasında maalesef etkili oldu. Diğer taraftan pandemiyle ilgili kısıtlamalar küresel tedarik zincirini kesintiye uğrattı. Yatırımları engelledi ve iş gücü piyasalarını ve milyonlarca insanın geçimini önemli ölçüde etkiledi. Ayrıca Covid-19 çok ciddi bir ekonomik eşitsizlik ve olumsuz ekonomik sonuçlar ortaya çıkardı. Belki de bugün de öncesinde tartıştığımız gibi bu bizim gözlem noktası oldu. Bunlar özellikle en kesimler dediğimiz kesimlerde daha kusura bakmayın. Tamam. Sorun yok.
Mehmet Bey devam edebilir sanırım. Bu arada belki Robert için bir çeviri cihazı da gerekebilir. Hani o Türkçe şey için. You need a translator? Do you have? Oh. Yeah, sure. Please. Mehmet Bey pardon lütfen devam edelim.
Kusura bakmayın tekrar.
Kusura bakmayın.
Son olarak bu ciddi ekonomik eşitsizlik konusuna değiniyordum. Bu tabii en büyük gözlemimiz oldu ve hala bunun aslında nereye doğru gidebileceğini, evrilebileceğini tam olarak kestiremiyoruz. En kırılgan kesimlerde özellikle bu sağlığa erişim, uzun vadede psikolojik etkiler bunları gözlemliyoruz. Tabii ana değişimlere baktığımızda gene aslında sektörle ve konuşmacılarla çok örtüşen gözlemlerimiz var. Bir tanesi dijitalleşme, dijital dönüşüm. Buradaki gözlemimiz de belki 10-15 yıl içinde yapılacak bir dönüşümün çok kısa zamanda, 2 yıl içinde çok hızlı gerçekleşmesi. Covid-19 krizi birçok ülkede dijital dönüşümü hızlandırdı. Teknolojinin ekonomide oynadığı rolü değiştirerek öğrenme, çalışma ve yaşam biçimlerimizi değiştirdi. Özellikle dijital teknolojilerdeki gelişme, kaynakların tahsisi, verimlilik artışı, sermaye emeğin daha etkin bir şekilde bir araya gelmesi, büyümeyi ve verimliliği çok önemli ölçüde geliştiriyor. Bu tür yapısal değişiklikler aslında 10 yılda, 20 yılda bir araya gelirken bu yaşadığımız dönemde çok hızlı bir değişime tabi kaldık. Tabii bu olumlu tarafları varken gene eşitsizliklerle bağlamında baktığımızda kriz aynı zamanda bölgeler, ülkeler ve ülkelerin içindeki toplumlar açısından da gittikçe artan bir dijital uçurumun olduğunu ortaya serdi. Süreçte daha iyi ekonomik koşulları olanlar ve şehirlerde yaşayanlar özellikle online hizmet ve mal sunumundan faydalanırken, bankacılık, sigortacılık hizmetlerine daha rahat erişirken, nüfusun önemli ölçüdeki kısmı bu dijital dönüşümün dışında kaldı. Ve bu devam ediyor bu trend, bunu gözlemliyoruz. Aslında bu özel sektör, firma düzeyinde de benzer bir gözlemimiz var. Bazı özel sektör firmaları bu dönüşümü çok iyi kapsayarak, anlaşarak ama birçoğu da bu dijital dönüşümün dışında kaldı. Bu en önemli gözlemlerimizden biri gene eşitsizlikle beraber. Bir diğer gözlemimiz aslında pandemi dönemine denk gelen ama içinde bulunduğumuz bu iklim değişikliğiyle o da hızlandı. Yeşil dönüşüm, sürdürülebilirliğe olan ihtiyaç. Biz de banka olarak bu özellikle dijital dönüşüm, pandeminin getirdiği sonuçlar, yeşil dönüşümle ilgili diğer uluslararası kalkınma bankaları ile birlikte bir işbirliğine gittik. Özellikle 2020 ve 2021 yıllarında özel sektör müşterilerinin kısa vadeli likidite ve sermaye ihtiyaçlarının karşılanması, ticaretin kolaylaştırılması, finansmanın genişletilmesi, temel altyapı destek programlarının geliştirilmesi gibi çeşitli adımlar attık ve kamu sektörüne bu konularda politika diyaloğuyla destek verdik. Peki ileriye baktığımızda bu pandemi ve gelişen iklim krizi, dijital dönüşüm, eşitsizliklerle ilgili dünya neler konuşuyor? Aslında gene burada galiba sektörle farklı değiliz. İçinde bulunduğumuz kalkınma finansman kuruluşları uluslararası strateji ve sermaye çerçevelerini belirlerken bu 3 alana odaklandılar. Önümüzdeki 5 ila 10 yıllık dönemde yeşil ve düşük karbonlu ekonomiye geçiş, fırsat eşitliği ve dijital dönüşümün desteklenmesi 3 ana konu olarak belirlenmiş durumda. EBRD'de diğer uluslararası finans kuruluşları gibi bu alanları destekleyecek. Bu noktada belki Türkiye Cumhuriyeti'ne de bir parantez açmamız gerekiyor. Bankanın küresel stratejileri ve Türkiye stratejisi de uyumlu olacak şekilde Türkiye'deki faaliyetlerinin en az %50'sini yeşil dönüşüme ayırmış durumda. Tabii burada ilk oturumda Bakan Bey'in de bahsettiği gibi, Başkanımızın da bahsettiği gibi Türkiye'nin geçen sene Paris Anlaşması'nı onaylaması ve akabinde oldukça iddialı bir iklim gündemini takip etmesi hükümet nezdinde bizi de oldukça heyecanlandırdı. Burada özellikle gördüğümüz iklim kanunu çalışmalarına oldukça hız verildi. Çevre Şehircilik ve yeni adıyla İklim Değişikliği Bakanlığı'yla bu konuda oldukça yakından çalışıyoruz ve özellikle bu alanda Türkiye için önemli bir fırsat olduğunu gözlemliyoruz. Özellikle pandemi ve Ukrayna-Rusya savaşının küresel etkileri göz önüne alındığında Türkiye'nin tedarik zincirleri, lojistik, ulaştırma bağlantıları gibi temel sektörlerin yanı sıra çelik, alüminyum gibi ham madde yoğun sektörlerde de rolünün artacağını gözlemliyoruz. Bu noktada da EBRD yeşil politika ve yatırımları destekliyor. Özellikle geçen sene Paris Anlaşması'nın Türkiye Cumhuriyeti tarafından onaylanmasından önce diğer kalkınma partnerlerimizle birlikte ki bunlar Dünya Bankası grubu, IFC, Almanya, Fransa ve Birleşmiş Milletler'le birlikte 2021 yılı Ekim ayında bir iklim mutabakat zaptı imzaladık Türkiye'de. Bu kapsamda da ilk olarak 3,2 milyar dolarlık bir yeşil dönüşüm finansmanı için imtiyazlı fonlar ve projelerin desteklenmesine yönelik deklarasyonun altına imza attık ama gördüğüm kadarıyla bu finansman bir ilk ama son olmayacak. Hem bu mutabakat zaptına diğer uluslararası kuruluşlardan, kalkınma kuruluşlardan destek gelecek hem de hükümet bu konudaki hedeflerini daha da arttıracağını düşünüyoruz. Gene çok kısa dijital dönüşüme tekrar dönmek istiyorum. Bu konu önemli bizim açımızdan hem adil bir dönüşümün gerçekleşmesi için, bu oluşan dijital uçurumun kapatılması için özel sektörle birlikte yakın çalışmanın çok önemli olduğunu görüyoruz. Özellikle altyapı yatırımları, KOBİ'lerin dijital dönüşümü, özel sektörün bu alandaki yatırımlarını da destekliyoruz. Son olarak zamanında farkındayım. Belki makroekonomik anlamdaki görüşlerimizi sizlerle paylaşmak isterim. Bahsettiğim gibi 71 ülke hissedarıyla çalışan bir kurumuz ama halihazırda 38 ülkede faaliyet gösteriyoruz. Bu ülkeler Moğolistan'dan Tunus'a, Polonya'dan Ürdün'e kadar geniş bir coğrafyada, Balkanlar'da, Orta Asya'da ve Türkiye'de yoğun çalışmalarımız var. Kendime alarm kurmuştum, kusura bakmayın. Tabii bu bölgemize baktığımızda pandeminin etkisiyle birlikte 2020 yılında %2,5'luk bir küçülmeyi ortalamada görüyoruz. 2021 yılında ise 6,7 oranında bir büyüme gözlemledik. Ancak Ukrayna-Rusya savaşının başta emtia ve gıda fiyatları üzerindeki baskısından olumsuz yönde etkilenmeleri kaçınılmaz olarak gözlemlenmekte. Bu etkinin özellikle Rusya ve Ukrayna ile tedarik ilişkileri güçlü olan ülkelerde daha derinden hissedildiği ve hissedileceği de kaçınılmaz. Bu bağlamda bu seneki toplam bölge büyüme tahminimizi yeni 1,1'e revize ettik. 2023 yılında işler daha kötüleşmezse özellikle bu enerji ve gıda fiyatları ile ilgili, enerji arzındaki anlaşmazlıklarla ilgili toplamda 4.7'lik bir büyüme öngörüyoruz. Toplam EBRD 38 bölgesi için. Türkiye özeline baktığımızda da Türkiye ekonomisinin gerek coğrafi konum, gerekse tarım, turizm, enerji gibi temel sektörlerde Rusya ve Ukrayna ile yakın işbirliği içerisinde olması nedeniyle savaşın gıda, petrol, doğalgaz ve metaller gibi emtia fiyatlarında yarattığı artıştan etkilendiği gözlemlenmekte. 2021 yılı için Türkiye ekonomisi net ihracatta ve hane halkı harcamalarındaki artış sonucunda %11 gibi çok iddialı bir büyüme oranına ulaştı. Ancak 2022 yılı ilk çeyrek göstergeleri, turizm gelirlerindeki belirsizlik dikkate alındığında biz EBRD olarak en son Mayıs ayında açıkladığımız bölgesel ekonomi raporumuzda Türkiye için büyümeyi %2.2 olarak revize etmiş durumdayız. Gene risklerde büyük bir değişiklik olmazsa 2023 için de Türkiye için %3.5 büyüme öngörüyoruz. Tabii bu noktada Türkiye'nin takip ettiği düşük faiz, az değerli TL ile rekabet gücünü arttırmayı hedefleyen arz odaklı yeni ekonomi modelini başta enflasyon ve kur olmak üzere ekonomi üzerinde yarattığı riski de yakından takip ettiğimizi söylemek isterim. Son olarak uygulanmakta olan politikalar neticesinde ihracat hacminde çok ciddi %40'a yakın bir artış olduğu, rekabet gücünde bir ilerlenme sağlanmasına rağmen Türkiye ülke ekonomisinin dış finansman ihtiyacının devam ettiği ve jeopolitik riskler, ekonomik kırılganlıkların orta ve uzun vadede arttığını gözlemliyoruz. Son olarak olumlu bir noktayla tekrar kapatalım Türkiye Cumhuriyeti açısından. Bankacılık sektörünün sermaye yeterlilik oranları, kamu maliyesinin borç gayri safi milli hasıla oranının hala %38 gibi görece olumlu bir şekilde görünüm sergilemesi bizim açımızdan olumlu. Kur korumalı mevduat uygulamasının kamu sektörü üzerindeki kamu mali sektörü üzerindeki getirebileceği olası riskler içinse izlemede kalıyoruz. Çok teşekkür ederim. Sorular varsa belki daha sonrasında da alabiliriz.
Çok teşekkürler, sağ olun. Evet, Mehmet Bey'in de belirttiği gibi aslında demin Robert da değindi. Sosyoekonomik bazı endişeler biraz daha ön plana çıkıyor. Özellikle sanırım gelir dağılımı eşitsizliği ve dünyada maalesef ve muhtemelen Ukrayna ve Rusya krizinin olası etkileri. Aslına bakarsanız ben sorular bölümüne saklayacağım. Rusya-Ukrayna süreci acaba bu yeşil süreçte bazı durmalara neden olacak mı ya da ötelemelere? Onu da birlikte tartışmak isteriz. Şimdi müsaadenizle ben Margarita'ya sözü vermek istiyorum. Kendisi komşu ülkemiz Yunanistan'dan bize çok benzeşik bir süreç geçirdiler ama onların da deneyimlerini hem Avrupa Birliği üyesi olarak hem bize benzer bir iklimden neler yaşadılar, nasıl geçirdi bu dönemi, Yunanistan sektör nasıl tepki verdi buna, Covid'in sonrasında. Rakamlarla biraz Yunanistan sigorta sektörüne bahsedebilir misin Margarita? Sence alınan en büyük dersler neydi? Lessons learned. Ne gibi fırsatlar var önümüzde? Bize bir... Please, please.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good morning to all of you. I would like to thank very much the Turkish Insurance Association for inviting me to this very interesting event in this beautiful city in still difficult conditions to which all of us had to adapt. I want to stay in this word. The ability to adapt is our humankind's best virtue. This is what helped us to survive on this planet, and of course, this is what helped us to go through this crisis, the COVID crisis. COVID-19 started as a health crisis, and soon it proved to be one of the most global and disruptive events of last centuries. The end of this crisis is still unknown because we cannot exclude the possibility of some new mutations, possibly more lethal. Everybody was affected by this crisis. Individuals, society, economy across the globe. We had millions of victims all over the world. We had social restrictions and distancing restrictions, a lot of anxiety, heavy pressure on health systems, unemployment, income losses, market volatility. So in such an environment, insurance sector could not escape. The insurance industry suffered a lot. It is one of the most expensive crises, and I read somewhere that Lloyd's estimate the cost of the crisis to be in excess of 200 billion euros. And it is not over yet, so we do not know yet the final cost. And we paid huge money for events cancellations, flight cancellations, and a lot of other claims. When this crisis started, insurers had three priorities. Business continuity was the first, health of their staff was the second, and third, how to serve customers properly. The customers, the clients, had so many things in their minds during the crisis that the last thing they wanted to deal with was their insurance cover. Yet, we will see that they had some problems. Supervisors also had to implement measures to minimize the impact of pandemic to clients. In the beginning, when we first came in touch with COVID, everything seemed as a nightmare. But very, very soon, I would say that in a matter of days, companies had to make their entire operation remote. The staff started working, teleworking, and we had a lot of video conferences. Very quickly, a lot of questions arose, and the cover of business interruption is one of them, and I will come back to this a little later. At the same time, insurers had to do their best for the interest of their clients during the crisis. They took a lot of measures, and as Michaela said, goodwill initiatives. And although they did so, the clients, in many cases, they were disappointed. And they were disappointed because their policies, in certain cases, did not cover pandemics. Insurers, if I have to speak in a general way, have so far dealt well with the COVID crisis due to two things. One is the nature of our business, which means that we are experienced in risk analysis and crisis planning. That's the first. And the second, which contributed a lot, is that we had made investments in networks, applications, laptops, showing that investing in technology is probably the best asset. The situation is managed, and the digital tools prove to be very essential. We have not been through the crisis totally. We do not know the final cost yet, but we have learned lessons which are valuable and which can turn to opportunities. I would like to see slide 6 if it's possible. It is about the lessons that we learned from the crisis. The first thing is that necessity is the mother of invention. We stood well teleworking because of our technology investments, which made our operation feasible. Additional technology investments will be needed. And a lot of new money, I would say, will be needed. And the existing trends towards automation and digitalization must continue and probably accelerate. Virtual interactions may open new opportunities for servicing, selling, and building relations with customers. People's relationship with technology changed. I can't say that we are in Greece the champions in technology. And I was very much surprised from myself and from other people that I saw how much they changed. We saw that the clients used the digital means both for their policies and claims. We saw automation in underwriting and claims processing. And we saw a trend for online sales. We saw new words like artificial intelligence, data analytics, blockchain, entering our insurance world. What was a problem? A problem that we identified, and it has already been mentioned, I think it was Michaela who mentioned that, is the problem of business interruption insurance. I'm not talking specifically about Greece because in Greece we had such a few policies. I mean, it was a rather marginal cover. But I'm talking on a European basis. And practically, after all the discussions that we had with our colleagues in Europe, what we understood is that there is a big problem of insurability of this kind of risk. Why? Because first, it is not something that happens random. It is a political decision that says, now we stop, now we have lockdown. And second, because the basis of insurance, which is that many people pay the premium and only few take compensations, is not applicable here. Because here everybody has to be in the lockdown. So can we pay everybody? Can it be a kind of insurance? Or let me put it in another word. Can the insurance sector, the private sector alone, take the burden of such a cover without collaborating with the state? It seems to us impossible. And I think that a lot of discussion must take place with the public sector in order to find a solution and make ourselves useful. Another thing is that insurers is about insurers and about their supervision. The Solvency II regime, which is Europe's regulatory and supervisory regime, worked well, and it proved itself to be fit and proper, with only some modifications necessary for which Insurance Europe is asking for. But generally speaking, there were no problems because insurers, European insurers, started and entered into this crisis being at a very safe financial position. And during all this crisis, supervisors, European supervisors, watched very, very carefully this crisis, and they tried to take some measures which had to do with lightening the burden of reporting, with temporary suspension of dividends, which is something that caused a lot of discussion, and with monitoring liquidity. Then the last two lessons that we learned, I would like to speak about them in one sentence, is we saw from the pandemic crisis that we insurers, we have to be very clear as to what is covered and what is not covered in our policies. Because there were some gray areas that needed, let's say, a lot of thinking to see whether something is covered or not. And I believe that consumers do not always understand the risk and the terms and the conditions of a policy, so we have to be very, very clear. Last lesson is that we need to strengthen our society's resilience to severe shocks, because it's predicted that in the future, these shocks will be more frequent. So, after these lessons that we learned, I would like to say only a very few words about the Greek insurance market. The Greek insurance market is a relatively small market comparing with the European standards. We have 48 insurance companies, members of the association, which are established in Greece, and a few more, around 10, working under freedom of services, mainly in the motor business. The number of companies decreases, but this is not a sign that the market decreases. On the opposite, it is because of mergers and acquisitions. So, the number of companies decreases, but the market increases. Premia. We have, as you know, first of all, we went through a very severe economic crisis from 2010 and some years. And as recovery started to come back, we had the next crisis, which was the COVID crisis. During the first financial crisis, we lost about a third of our GDP and about 30% of our insurance premium, which we started, of course, gradually to take back. Now, the Greek insurance market is close to 5 billion euro premium production, which is 2.5% of our gross annual product, of our GDP, 2.5. This is equally shared, 50-50, between life and non-life. So they are at the same level, I would say. Investments are more than 10% of GDP, 20 billion euro. And in life business, there is a very significant trend to unit-linked policies all the recent years, all the last years. We sell very few of traditional products. The great majority is unit-linked products. The agenda of things that are being discussed is the same like everywhere. It has to do with climate change and environmental challenges and nat cat insurance. And the insurance industry in Greece has made a proposal to the government so that this nat cat insurance becomes compulsory, but there is not such an agreement yet. We talk a lot about the COVID implications, about digitalization and the need for technology, about cyber, of course, cyber insurance. And recently, with all the last evolutions and the war, we see the problem of inflation and fears for a possible recession. But let's hope that it will not happen. The two classes of business that were affected by the COVID most, it was the health branch and the motor branch. In the health area, it was the state who took the main burden and the lead to deal with all the health crisis, and people that suffered from COVID, if they needed treatment, they had to go to the state hospitals. So the role of the private sector was, let's say, not the role of a protagonist. So it was the state. And the frequency of the people that used their medical policy, their insurance policy, and got paid by that, it was smaller because people avoided to go to hospitals and make a surgery or a treatment because they did not want to be in a hospital with so many people suffering from COVID. So we had a fall in the frequency. In the motor business, we had a severe fall in the premia of around 6%, coming from the year 2020. In 2021, it was rather stable. Why did we have all this? Because the frequency of claims reduced, and it was natural. During the lockdowns especially, we had such a decrease. I don't want to say anything more about the Greek market, but I can answer to questions if you have ones. And I would like to come to my last point, which is the opportunities. In fact, all the lessons that we learned from the COVID can turn to opportunities. Can I have 14 slide? Slide 14. Yes. So, first thing is about teleworking. I think that teleworking is here to stay. I don't know whether it will be the norm for the future or whether it's going to be a mixed system, but we saw severe economies with that system. And some companies had started to use teleworking before the crisis, for 1 or 2 days a week. And during the crisis, almost every company had this system. We saw that it can work very well. I don't say that this is an absolute solution because I do understand that people need to be together and discuss. They like to be together, but it proved to be, teleworking proved to be very good system, and I think that it will bring savings. And economies are very important for our job. So we will see it in the future. It will not stop. The second thing is that the need to accelerate digital technology in insurance. We saw that clients, consumers, want digital approach. So we must build on that. We must build on digital technology to develop simple products for savings, for example, products like the pension product, the European pension product. We understood that digitalization can provide better products and services at lower cost, and cost is very essential. We must work a lot. The third opportunity is we must work a lot on consumer trust. Because our industry, the insurance industry, is based on trust. And although this happens, many of consumers were disappointed because they could not understand why they are not covered, or they could not understand some terms of their policies, and created a lot of questions. So a very significant opportunity for us is to work a lot on our policies and on our terms and conditions. Another opportunity, already mentioned by others, is the need for close collaboration of all factors. I mean insurance companies, supervisors, governments, consumers. This is a valuable tool because if we do not collaborate, we cannot find solutions. Another opportunity is that of public-private partnership. There is a very big discussion, I understand, in all the countries about this. And COVID only highlighted what we know from other cases also. We have seen that in systemic risks, in NatCat, in cyber, in all these areas we have seen the need to collaborate as private sector with the public sector. We need to have shared solutions. We need to have them. Final remark is that in all cases, we have to look at the future and work proactively. We must invest in the future now, because there will be future crises, and maybe there will be such crises increasing even more. So we have to develop strategies, we have to develop products, we have to develop services that will go along with the future crisis. I think that the recovery will come, and this recovery must be built on green and digital transitions. It must be a sustainable recovery. And I would like to close repeating the same work, is that we will recover because we have the willingness and the ability to adopt. The willingness to adopt and the willingness to collaborate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Margarita, for your very covering speech. Margarita da bahsetti. Aslında bugünkü konularımızın çoğu çok benzeşik başlıklar içeriyor. Ülke pratikleri de çok benziyor birbirine. Özellikle deneyimlediğimiz şeylerin bu kadar birbirine yakın olması da gerçekten çok ilgi çekici. Dünyanın neresinde olursa olur. Dolayısıyla bu belki de bir globalleşmenin de bir etkisi. Ama kültürel farklılıklar olmasına rağmen bu benzeşmeler de kolaborasyon, işbirliği, deneyim paylaşımı açısından da çok fırsatlar barındırdığında bence göstergesi. Son olarak Robert'a söz vermek istiyorum. Robert Neal. Robert, sen de Amerika'nın hayat sektörünü hep ağırlıklı olarak non-life konuştuk. Biraz belki genelden bahsettik ama life'a, hayat sigortalarına fokuslandığımız zaman küresel piyasalarda hayat branşı malum daha baskın. Yani biz Türkiye'de maalesef de hala bu konuda küçük bir paya sahibiz ama Yunanistan tecrübesinde de %50-50, dünyada da 50'nin üzerinde hayatın payı. Hayat tarafında neler oldu bizdekinin aksine? İvme buradan geliyor. Hayat sigortacılığı nasıl etkilendi? Mortalite tablolarında değişiklikler yapmayı düşündü mü Amerikan sigortacılığı? Seni dinlemek isteriz. Söz sende.
Thank you. I'm going to exactly. I'm going to follow Margarita's example and use the podium here. Good morning. I'm the other Robert from the American Council of Life Insurers. We represent the U.S. life and pension industry, so give that perspective today. It's a wonderful honor to be here as part of the summit and to be in the beautiful city of Istanbul. Thank you to the association's esteemed chairman, Attila, and to Özgür and Aysun for all your work organizing. It's a pleasure to be here. These events, these gatherings are critical. Very important to have government and industry together. Good to be in a room together again, actually, after 2 years. To share ideas, to share best practices, to understand each other's systems, to improve society, to protect families and to protect businesses, just to have a dialogue between government and industry and consumers. This is key, and we do the same thing in the U.S. and through JIFIA. So my CEO, Susan Neely, sends her best regards to the leaders here. She hopes to be with you someday to represent JIFIA, where she currently serves as vice president. We truly value our collaboration with the Turkish Association as a fellow JIFIA member and look forward to continuing work with our Turkish colleagues and other colleagues around the globe as we continue to tackle the critical issues facing our countries as we bounce back from COVID, where insurers continue to play a crucial role in protecting families and businesses and economic losses. In the U.S., we actually recently exceeded 1 million lives lost from COVID, so this is certainly significant, and we're taking it seriously. ACLI's international advocacy focuses on our federal agencies, in particular Treasury, the Federal Reserve, the USTR, the State Department, the Department of Labor, and the Commerce Department, as well as the insurance commissioners, the North American insurance commissioners, the state supervisors. These entities represent the U.S. interest abroad for our industry and our international entities, the G20, the IAS, the FSB, the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD, and the International Organization for Pension Supervisors. We also recognize the important role of the G20 and have been part of important discussions even here in Turkey when Turkey held the G20 presidency several years ago. We've been impressed with Turkey's leadership role in global discussions then and now. As I spoke about last night at the speakers' dinner with folks here, I previously had a role at Treasury. I know several members of the Turkish Association also worked within the government, as well as Margarita mentioned that she also worked for the Greek supervisors. So you learn a different perspective working for the government and then being with the industry, and those perspectives and the dialogue is critical, as I mentioned earlier. So today I wanted to turn to two issues that my CEO has been speaking about frequently. First, the unique role of insurance in our global society and how that role is evolving in the 21st century, especially in the aftermath of COVID. Second, the opportunities the insurance sector has to meet societal needs. As we've heard this morning, we are collectively facing several global challenges, but there are also opportunities. I'll share from their perspectives ACLI in the United States and in what we have observed by our counterparts around the globe. Life insurers exist to provide relief when times are tough. Our policies often stay with families for decades. They count on us to plan for tomorrow so they can live with greater certainty today. Our promise to them is that we will be there no matter what, and we are. When the pandemic hit, life insurers were there. The pandemic hit many industries hard, airline, retail, restaurants, as we've heard from our P&C colleagues, but we were the industry that was writing checks and paying out claims to families. We were there when the worst came. In the U.S., benefits paid in 2020 were the highest in history. The industry paid $90 billion in life insurance benefits. It was the largest increase in claims since the flu pandemic of 1918. We are an essential partner. We're there for the long term. We solve problems that government cannot. And of course, our industry provides more than death benefits. Families around the world count on life insurance products for protection, long-term savings, and a guarantee of lifetime income when it's time to retire. Given today's economic uncertainties, the financial and retirement security these products provide has never been more important. Changing demographics, longer lifespans, and modern work arrangements mean consumers need new and innovative products to provide long-term financial protection. Government and industry must work together to address these needs creatively through government policies that allow industry to increase intergenerational wealth. The U.S. is a leader in developing and promoting defined contribution pension plans. And it was good to hear that Turkey is also supporting and growing in that area. Indeed, many economic studies have demonstrated that the expansion of the U.S. private pension system played a critical role in broadening and deepening capital markets and fostering a long-term investment culture. Some studies have also argued that the U.S. private pension system has helped to foster economic and political stability. Today, American workers enjoy a security of owning their retirement savings, bringing with it stability and a culture of savings that has blossomed in 40 years into a self-sustaining engine of capital formation. However, our industry's ability to play this pivotal role depends on certain bedrock principles, including the rule of law, contract sanctity, and the stability afforded by institutions and sovereign commitments. These must prevail against the test presented by political expediency. Of course, if our companies are forced out of markets, we won't be able to contribute to economic growth or financial security. Preserving and growing intergenerational wealth relies upon our industry's ability to trust in the institutions in any given market. Engaging with government, business, labor, and other important stakeholders is key to ensure the private pension systems offer greater access and financial security to as many citizens as possible. The bottom line, long-term investments require long-term trust. That's something that's true in policy dialogues, and it's also true in consumer expectations of corporations. In the 21st century, the role of corporations is changing. For insurers, paying claims is not enough. Now corporations and business sectors are expected to demonstrate how they are helping to solve societal challenges. Today, consumer trust is built around this commitment and this engagement. Luckily for the insurance industry, we are problem solvers. We hold solutions to some of the big challenges facing countries around the globe, like pensions and retirement and financial inclusion. The leadership opportunity for business is to advocate solutions at a time when needs are most acute. Insurance associations can be force multipliers in addressing these challenges. We have a powerful solution to bring forward, and we are. Here are two very specific ways we see it taking shape within the industry, both in the U.S. and around the world. First, we are enthusiastically and diligently fighting for financial inclusion. In the U.S., we're advocating for the next iteration of retirement security legislation that will improve sustainable financial inclusion for millions of Americans. If we remove barriers to saving for low-income earners, part-time workers, student loan borrowers, military spouses, and people close to retirement who haven't saved enough. JIFIA has been active in supporting global industry and government programs on access to insurance and financial inclusion as well. This effort is currently led by the Latin American Industry Association, FIDES, but is relevant in every market. JIFIA strongly supported the 2021 Italian G20 Special Program on Women's Empowerment by producing a first-ever survey of national and regional association efforts. JIFIA has shared this survey with international development organizations, G20 finance ministers, central bank governors. And our colleague from Spain, a fellow Insurance Europe member, was very active in this effort, along with Francisco and colleagues around the world. We're continuing this under the 2022 Indonesian G20 presidency. This time we're expanding the scope of our effort beyond gender to look at the broader set of issues being discussed collectively as diversity, equity, and inclusion. We also shared our research with the International Association for Insurance Supervisors, which is itself undertaking a stock-taking of diversity, equity, and inclusion elements and national level regulation among their members. JIFIA is engaging both the Latin American Association of Supervisors and the IAS as they explore diversity, equity, inclusion issues specific to insurance. That's happening next week at the JIFIA event in Prague. Second, we are doubling down on our commitment to ESG at ACLI, particularly the societal and governance aspects. Much work is underway by the life insurance industry as a whole to achieve these vital measures. The 2021 Special Initiative on Women's Empowerment under the G20 presidency develop policy recommendations that will help business and governments around the world achieve gender equity. The 2022 Indonesian G20 and following years, chaired by India and Brazil, will bring a development focus to gender and social equity. Last month, ACLI announced the formation of an impact investing initiative. This groundbreaking nonprofit investment partnership will exponentially expand the industry's capacity to help close the racial wealth gap and drive upward mobility in communities of color in the U.S. The nonprofit investment partnership will support community development with a focus on sustainable, affordable housing. And let me close by saying this. The life insurance industry is designed to be there for people when they need it the most. We provide access to financial protection, and we can be an important partner to the government sector in solving big challenges. In fact, this collaboration between public and private sector is an ideal way to address financial inclusion, ESG, and delivering retirement financial security. So thank you in closing. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today, and happy to join my colleagues to answer any questions you may have.
Evet, teşekkürler Robert. Günün ilk panelini tamamlamış bulunuyoruz. Çok kısa sorular varsa almak isteriz. Zamanımızı da belli bir ölçüde aştığımız için sizlerin de muhtemelen sabahtan beri devam eden bu session'da açlık sınırınızı zorladığımızı düşünüyorum. Ama yine de bu kadar değerli konuğu karşımızda bulmuşken birkaç kelime belki sormak ihtiyacı olabilir. Deneyim paylaşım açısından. Herhangi bir soru var mı? Öncelikle. Sanırım yok. Ben kapatmadan önce şöyle bir toparlama yapmak istiyorum. Görünen şu ki sigorta sektörü pandemi döneminde inisiyatifler alarak üzerine düşen getirmiştir. Hem Türkiye'de hem dünyada. Bütün meslektaşlarımın verdiği örneklerde de olduğu gibi biz özellikle devlet ve özel sektör işbirliği konusunda çok önemli adımlar atmışız farkında olmadan. Tamamen sigortalılarımızın hasarlarını ve hayat sürdürülebilirliklerini, hasarlarını cover etmek ve hayat sürdürülebilirliklerini sağlamak açısından. Dolayısıyla bu anlamda sektörün ne kadar önemli bir rol üstlendiğini bir kez daha görmüş olduk. Kısaca ben tekrar mottomuzu tekrar ederek kapatmak ve panelistlerime teşekkür etmek istiyorum. Sigorta kıymetlidir. Afiyet olsun. Ben panelistlerimize tek tekrar katılımları için çok teşekkür ederim. Robert, Michaela, Margarita, Mehmet Bey ve Robert Neil. Bizleri kırmayıp davetimize icabet ettiğiniz için çok teşekkür ederim. Hepinize çok teşekkürler bizleri dinlediğiniz için.
Özgür Bey çok teşekkürler. Bütün size ve bütün değerli katılımcılara, online olarak da etkinliğimize, zirveye ve bu panele katılan değerli katılımcılara çok teşekkür ederiz. Özgür Bey, panelin sonunda hediyelerini takdim etmek üzere sizden ricada bulunabilir miyim değerli katılımcılarımıza lütfen?
Evet, bugünün anlam ve önemi için kendilerine ufak bir hazırlık yapmıştık. Malumunuz dün başlayan bir sergimiz var. Sigorta haritaları ile alakalı. Evet. Ben önce Margarita'dan başlamak istiyorum. Online katılımcılarımıza maalesef postayla göndereceğiz. Margarita lütfen. Margarita, please. If you have, yeah, thank you very much for your.
Thank you very much.
Let's.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your.